funerary customs, much like a lot of other Rome's religious and cultural things, were like a hodgepodge. So they had some Etruscan stuff, some Greek stuff, some stuff from other places. We'll see in a minute how their culture interacted with Egypt. And the thing about Rome is that, like, once you get into the late Republic and early Empire, you see individuals kind of doing their own thing, exploring the possibilities of funerary architecture and really personalizing their tombs for how they wanted them to look. A really good example of that is the Tomb of the Baker, I'll put right here, which is made to actually look like an oven. So reflecting the interests and, occupation of the deceased in life. So you get a lot of variation. But if you ask me what's like the most important type of funerary remains that we can look at, I would say inscriptions. Because the Romans, unlike the Etruscans, did do a lot of writing, and it was much more widely available. Even for people who were illiterate, they could go and hire a scribe, and that primarily would have been how these were produced. And the reason I think it's so important is because you really get an insight into the psychology of individual Romans. And again, you can tell so much about their situation just by reading what they left behind for us to read. So I'm going to show two examples of funerary inscriptions that I think are some of the most significant objects that we have. So the first one here, we don't have a secure date for this, but it's probably around the 2nd century CE. And this is what we call a funerary stele, which is just like a flat, almost our equivalent of a tombstone. And already this is a pretty elaborate one because there's an image on it. So that says that the person who had this produced, who purchased this, had a significant amount of money. So let's go through what it says. The top line here, you have diis manibus. Sometimes this is spelled just dis manibus with one I. It's just a variation. And what it means is to the divine shades, to the Holy Spirits. This is an invocation that is, by this point, fairly standard. It's the same kind of as like RIP. It's just like a stock thing that people say, but it's a reference to the spirits of the deceased and the underworld and all that stuff. So this next word, sacrum, that refers to the tombstone itself. So this sacrum, for, and then you get the person's name. For philologists, the name is in the dative, which means to or for this person. P. Sextilio Fortunato. So P is the standard abbreviation for Publius. So this guy's name was Publius Sextilius Fortunatus. This is not a usual, typical Roman name. Fortunatus is not typical. It's actually more akin to slave names. Slaves were often named by their captors with like adjectives. So they didn't always keep their own name in their own language. They were given this other name. And so you see a lot of slaves named Felix, for example. So like lucky, fortunate one. Fortunatus is another one. So this tells us already that something interesting is going on here. So let's keep reading. Now, right before Fortunatus, you get P. Lib. Okay, so this is an abbreviation. P again for Publius. And then the LIB is an abbreviation for the word libertus. A libertus was a particular social designation, which we usually translate as freedman or liberta, freedwoman, or liberti, freed people. And this was a social class that was in between like the common freeborn citizens and the lowest rung of society, which was people who were currently enslaved. Libertus, freedman, was someone who had been enslaved but was no longer enslaved for whatever reason. And there were lots of reasons why this would happen. Manumission was comparatively common, at least like way more common than it was in the American system. So there were a lot of liberty in Rome, and enough to make it like a separate designation of people with specific rights and restrictions on them. So our question about Fortunatus and how he got his name, now we know. He was enslaved. He was enslaved by someone named Publius. And in fact, he took the name Publius upon manumission. That was pretty common, and actually Sextilius is probably also the name of his former captor, former master. So that is who the tombstone is dedicated to. Let's read on. The next line here, qui vixit annos, and then you get a number, and then you get mensibus, and then you get another number. Mensibus is abbreviated, but that's what this means. Fortunatus, who lived for 22 years and 3 months. So far, this tombstone is looking very much like a modern tombstone. Rest in peace, so-and-so, who lived, on these dates. Now, I like this a lot because it looks almost as if the scribe had originally written 21, and then the purchaser of the tombstone was like, no, 22, and then they had to carve an extra one on the side there. I love that. I think that's pretty cool. That's one of the reasons why I like this a lot, because not only do you get to read what it says, but you also get to see the way that it was inscribed, and that tells you a little bit more about the interaction between the purchaser and the producer. Let's read on. Sextilia P. lib. Isias. Okay, so now things get interesting. You have Sextilia, which is the feminine version of Sextilius. So this is some kind of relative of our guy, Publius Sextilius Fortunatus. And we see again P. lib. So we see that she is a liberta, exactly the same as Fortunatus had been a libertus of the same guy, Publius. And then Isias is probably her surname. So whether that's a married name, maybe she got married after she was freed, or maybe this has some other thing to do with her. We don't really know. And her name is in the nominative, which means that she is doing some kind of action. So let's read on to see what kind of action she's doing. Filio carissimo fecit. Okay, so the verb fecit here from facio, meaning to do or to make. So she made, and then you go all the way back up to the top, she made this sacrum. So now we finally understand what's going on here. I'm not going to regale you with Latin word order or anything like that, but essentially this woman Sextilia, who is a freed woman, has set up this tombstone for Sextilius Fortunatus, and she tells us filio carissimo. He was her most dear son. So my favorite thing about this tombstone is in this line, and that is that carissimo is usually spelled with a C, but here it's spelled with a K. Latin didn't have the letter K, they used C for everything, but Greek had a K, and Greek was the literary language, and it was the language of the most learned people. And in fact, slaves who were captured from Greece were often put in positions where they were expected to read and write. So things like tutors or doctors or maybe scribes, maybe producers of tombstones. Or it could have been that Sextilia and her son were themselves Greek, and she was telling the producer how to write. So we're getting a little sense that someone in this interaction is Greek. Now the rest of the inscription reads, et sibi et suis et libertis libertabusque posterisque eorum. Sextilia Isias made this tombstone for her most dear son and for herself and for suis. This is kind of like you and yours. It means like made it for herself and for her people, for her kinsmen, for her friends and family, for her loved ones. And libertis libertabusque posterisque eorum. And her freedmen and freedwomen and their descendants. If you haven't already picked up on it, what this is saying is that Sextilia is dedicating this to her freedmen and freedwomen, or to her son's freedmen and freedwomen, which indicates that Sextilia and her son, upon manumission, themselves actually purchased slaves who they subsequently freed. The fact that former slaves themselves were enslaving other people and freeing them the way that they themselves had been freed. This is a very intriguing object. It is very richly decorated. The lettering is beautiful. You don't always see lettering that is this high quality. This would have been a very expensive item. And it's true that freedmen and freedwomen did actually have an opportunity to make a lot of money in Rome, some of which may have been used to continue on in the system of slavery and to purchase slaves of their own. We see where, our understanding may not be sufficient to explain, okay, there were enslaved peoples who then were freed. But that's not the full picture, is it? The other Roman inscription that I want to look at comes from the 3rd century CE, so a little bit later even than that. And it's this image right here. So the first thing you might notice about it is that there's 2 different scripts on here. At the top and the bottom you have Latin letters, and then in the middle you actually have Greek letters. This is not unusual. In fact, we saw it in the last inscription, but it does show that these 2 languages were very closely connected with one another, and that a lot of people spoke both. Starting at the top, you have DM. This is an abbreviation for Dis Manibus, again, RIP, and then I'm actually going to skip the Greek and come back to it and start with the Latin. So down the bottom here, you have the name of the deceased, Liciniae Amiati, again in the dative signifying that this is set up for Licinia Amia, or Amias maybe. And then you get a description of her, also in the dative. It says Bene Merenti. She lived well deserving. And then Weeksit here, it just means she lived, and then the rest of it is cut off. I would imagine that you'd have like the dates of her life or her age, how long she lived. So far, very straightforward. But let's take a look at the Greek. So I'll put a transliteration here. This says ichthus zonton, which means fish of the living. Fish of the living? What does that mean? As you can see, it is also illustrated with a couple of fish and an anchor. Was this person a fisherman? Was Licinia Ammias a fisherman? Maybe. But there's actually a better explanation. I hope you're ready for your mind to be blown, because my mind was blown the first time I encountered this many years ago. You may have actually seen a bumper sticker that looks like this, or a poster, a magnet, a tattoo. This is a Christian symbol of a fish. Why a fish? Well, if you take the word for fish in Greek, which is ichthus, and you parse it out, you see that it is an acronym. Jesus Christos Theou Huios Soter. Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. Early Christianity, as you may or may not know, was not well accepted in Roman society, and they needed to be very careful when discussing their faith. So they came up with a lot of secret symbols and acronyms, and this was one of them. So if you see this fish, this is one of the oldest Christian symbols that there is. This tombstone itself is actually one of the earliest depictions of Christian art. So we get a lot out of this tombstone, fragmentary though it may be. We really don't have all of it. So to recap, you have rest in peace, dis manibus, to the divine shades. You have fish of the living, meaning like the savior of humanity, with a little illustration, and then you get the name of the deceased. It's bilingual, it has secret symbols on it, and you'd never know looking at it. Just an unsuspecting Roman would say, fish of the living, what's that all about? The person who made this must not have known Greek very well, and move on. So it's a way for Licinia Ammias to include her religion without there being any blowback on her loved ones.